Good morning, everybody. Looking at today's program, I thought I'd be best placed to just give a bit of a high-level picture of what we're seeing emerging in the region over the last year or so. Clearly, for many of us that are living, working, doing business in the region, it's been a pretty sad and distressing year on many fronts in the CIS region. Typically, we consult our clients on regulatory risks, political risks, economic challenges of the countries that we work in and that our clients work in. But this year, we opened up in January having to try and help our clients reach their employees in Kazakhstan, get their employees out of Kazakhstan. We've also seen unrest and violence in Nagorno-Karabakh, in the South Caucasus, and of course, border skirmishes between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. But of course, it's Russia's war in Ukraine that's dominating the agenda and is likely to dominate the agenda for a while to come. Really, this war has seen the nations of this region pushed and pulled in different directions by all the geopolitical forces that we're seeing involved in this conflict. Mongolia, of course, is sandwiched between Russia and China and having to rethink its own geopolitical stance. Uzbekistan has kept a studious distance from Russia and the conflict, but it has been impacted by the economic fallout of the conflict. And then, of course, the mining sector has been impacted by sanctions risk. But it's perhaps Kazakhstan, of course, that best exemplifies the stresses and strains that the war in Ukraine has brought to the region. As many of you will know, Kazakhstan is obviously a very close partner of Russia. It shares the world's largest land border with Russia. It's in a military alliance. It's in an economic union with Russia. And it's highly dependent on Russia for exports, not only trade with Russia, but exports out into the wider world. But at the same time, Kazakhstan is not an ally of Russia when it comes to Ukraine. In fact, it's been steadfast in its support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It's not recognized Russian claims on Ukrainian territory. And critically, for those of us that are doing business in Kazakhstan, the government of Kazakhstan has made serious commitment to respect the contours of the Western sanctions regime. So that minimizes, or at least as much as possible, minimizes the risk that Kazakhstan will be subject to direct sanctions by Western countries. This allows Kazakhstani companies to continue to raise money in places such as London, and we see a number of Kazakhstani public companies still listed on the London Stock Exchange. It also allows investors such as yourselves to continue raising money on capital markets here. Although Kazakhstan has officially declared neutrality on the war in Ukraine, it is engaged in a bit of a strategic realignment very quietly. It's reinvigorated its relations with Western powers, particularly the United States and the European Union. The president of Kazakhstan has traveled on several occasions to Gulf nations, and China, of course, is growing ever more as a critical partner for the Central Asia region. As we speak, I understand that the president of Kazakhstan is on his way to France, having just visited Moscow yesterday. The most obvious example of Kazakhstan's strategic realignment was probably the visit of Chinese President Xi Jinping to Astana in September. For the first time ever during this visit, a Chinese president offered a security guarantee to a Central Asian nation. President Xi made it very clear that China would not tolerate any attempts to destabilize Kazakhstan. So that is a big change in the relations between Central Asia and China. We see in the oil sector as well as metals and mining that China is growing ever more as a trade partner, and already it consumes 65% of Kazakhstan's copper output. China's nuclear energy ambitions are also likely to see its relations deepen with Central Asia, particularly Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Last year we saw for the first time China, which has long been a major buyer of Kazakhstani uranium, become an owner of a uranium asset in Kazakhstan, acquiring 49% of a uranium mine alongside Kazakhstani state uranium miner Kazatomprom. China is also likely to play a part in Kazakhstan's nuclear program, as is actually France. And we may hear some news this week from France about what roles France will play in Kazakhstan's emerging nuclear program. This is, again, quite a significant shift, given that it was long assumed that Russia's Rosatom would be the only foreign partner involved in the nuclear program. Turning to the mining industry, of course, the war in Ukraine has had tremendous impacts. Many of you will know that the Russian mining industry is closely interwoven with the Kazakhstani mining industry, with Russian investors engaged in Kazakhstan, and more Kazakhstani investors engaged in Russia. Russia is obviously a key destination for Kazakhstani exports from the mining sector. 30% of Kazakhstani oil, iron and steel goes to Russia. And there's obviously a healthy trade in mining equipment, particularly drilling equipment. So since the outbreak of the war, many of these relationships have had to be untangled, not just due to existing sanctions, but also the threat of future sanctions. So we're seeing also among our clients a high degree of self-sanctioning, as it's known. Critically, Kazakhstan and the rest of Central Asia have had to reconsider their export routes. Geography dictates that Russia is perhaps the most efficient conduit to reach Europe and other global markets from Kazakhstan. More than 8% of Kazakhstan's copper exports are going to Europe at the moment. But the war is changing that geography quite significantly. So we see it in the energy industry, but also in mining, that Kazakhstan is seeking to export more to China, its direct neighbor to the east, obviously. And perhaps of greater interest to those of you that are here today, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are also trying to access Europe, the Middle East and North Africa through what's called the Middle Corridor. What is the Middle Corridor? For those of you who haven't heard of it, it's a rather truncated trade route that is emerging, essentially from Western China through Kazakhstan, I should say Western China, through Kazakhstan, across the Caspian Sea, down into the South Caucasus and out into either the Black Sea or into Turkey. The concept of the Middle Corridor is now more than 10 years old. It was originally designed as an alternative route for Chinese exports to reach European markets, also the Middle East and North Africa. Clearly, China's exports are highly dependent on sea routes. These routes could be contested by the United States in the case of escalation of tensions. And so China has been building a northern route across Russia into Europe, and also this Middle Corridor. Now, clearly, the Middle Corridor is the most complex of these routes, as it's multimodal, adding huge amounts of costs and logistical challenges, and it crosses a huge number of different jurisdictions. So 3 nations in the South Caucasus, obviously Kazakhstan, potentially Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia. So this realignment is not straightforward. The Middle Corridor nations themselves have their own challenges. While Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, for example, are largely good geopolitical partners, relations between Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan in terms of developing concrete infrastructure have not always been easy. And of course, we have, again, the threat of war in Nagorno-Karabakh or over Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So that throws the whole southern route through the South Caucasus into question. We also believe, for example, that the Armenian government is fragile at the moment, and we could see it fall. So what about more long term? Geopolitical shifts are obviously going to have a longer term impact on the mining industry in Central Asia. First and foremost, the Ukraine war has obviously exposed Western nations' dependence on critical resources from Russia. The focus this year has obviously been on natural gas, given the energy crisis that we're facing. But if we think longer term, how is this going to evolve? We need to be thinking more about strategic minerals, and I know many of you here today are focused on that area. Currently, Russia provides 10% of global nickel supplies, 6% of global aluminium supplies, and also significant shares of critical minerals such as titanium, scandium, and palladium, 37% of the world's exports of palladium. So while Russia's not a major I should also add that Russia is obviously not a major producer of uranium, but it is the source of 46% of the world's uranium enrichment capacity. So I don't think you need me to tell you the strategic importance of these minerals, particularly given the energy transition we're facing. In fact, a conversation I was having this morning, I was told, and I think this is exactly right, that access to minerals is obviously the key strategic threat to the energy transition. An example of that is nickel consumption. Currently, we consume about 200,000 tons of nickel a year. Demand, according to the IEA, suggests that we're going to be consuming 3 million tons of nickel by 2040. Sounds a long way away, but it's only sort of 16, 17 years away. And even today, in our relatively lower consumption of nickel, markets are already tight. So any disruption or any risk of disruption is already a significant market event for people engaged in the metals markets. And then there's China. We need to think about the role of China as we develop our interest in strategic minerals. Obviously, this year we've also seen a great rise in tensions between the United States and China. Mineral resources are set to be a key front for this tension, and they always have been, actually. I was reading earlier that in 2010, China embargoed the export of some strategic minerals to Japan, 10, 15 years ago, just because of territorial disputes in the Southeast China Sea. This year, it's been the United States that's hardened its position towards China in terms of strategic minerals and technology. So you'll be familiar with the CHIPS Act that was passed a few months ago, and of course the ban on the sale of Chinese semiconductors to China that have US technological imports. Of course, you will know that China has its own levers to pull in this race, particularly rare earth elements. China is the source of approximately 90% of the rare earth elements that we consume today. And so in the face of growing tensions between the United States and China, Western nations are going to have no choice but to seek alternate sources of rare earth elements. And this, of course, takes us back to Central Asia. All of these developments are already resulting in increased interest in Central Asia as a source of rare earth elements. Also, there's now a big turn towards copper and uranium. Just this month, the European Union signed a strategic agreement with Kazakhstan on closer integration on what they call strategic value chains, and they specifically reference rare earths, batteries, and hydrogen energy. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are obviously aware of the opportunity and the potential benefits to their own economies. So we've seen, for example, in Uzbekistan, the creation of a new state-owned entity to engage in the exploration and production of rare earths and uranium. Just last month, the president of Kazakhstan called on the Kazakhstani Geological Survey to increase its exploration of rare earth assets. According to existing studies, there are 384 known deposits of rare earth elements in Central Asia, but as many of you will know, this is based on data that is perhaps 50 years old or even older, and certainly not using the most modern exploration techniques. So there's certainly a huge amount out there that is yet to be discovered. Certainly our clients are spending a lot of time now thinking about how to engage with these countries to try and discover some of these elements. It's maybe, I think, just to say to close, a fortuitous time for investors to be considering Central Asia, particularly Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. As we're likely to hear in subsequent presentations, the governments are attempting to reform their economies, attempting to adopt legislation that will allow for foreign investment into exploration and production. This is all highly welcome. Those of us that have been involved in the region for sort of 10, 15, 20 years, you will know that it's not always been straightforward to do business in these countries. But certainly the clients that we speak to are more optimistic than they have been over the last few years about accessing Kazakhstan and also Uzbekistan. We also note a serious change in tone from officials and civil servants that we speak to when we're in country in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and that's really encouraging. I think to close, we have to understand that reform is difficult. for these countries. There are a huge amount of geopolitical, socio-economic challenges that these countries face. Reform is never guaranteed, and it doesn't always take us exactly to where we want to be. But certainly in our discussions in Astana and in Tashkent, we are getting the impression that if there is a time to take another look at Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan particularly, this is perhaps a good time to do it. So I think that the timing of the event today is pretty fortuitous. With that, I'll hand over to the other panelists. Thank you very much.